Good morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Wednesday, October 8th. I am joined by our deputy editor at 11 Warriors, Dan Hope, for another look at the state of the Big Ten with the impending release today of his Big Ten power rankings. Dan, how are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm still beaming after not only a wonderful win for Ohio State this past weekend, but as I've called it on earlier shows this week, the frames janklining of all frames janklinings, which I'm sure we will get into in this edition of examining the Big Ten power rankings, courtesy of Dan Hope. But before we do that, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor at the 11 Dubcast and 11 Warriors this Ohio State football season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. From game day to workday, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. All right. So, Dan, before we dance on the grave of Penn State further, as has been the theme of every show I've done this week, and how can you not, milk the cow for all it, or milk the Nittany Lion, if you will, for all it's worth? Let's talk about the top of the Big Ten, the teams that are still elite relative to Ohio State. At this point, you've got Oregon, and I don't want to say surprising because they certainly announced themselves to the world in the college football playoff last year. But in terms of entrenching themselves over multiple years near the top of the sport, Indiana certainly seems like they are on the trajectory to do that. And so those are the two big names that are in the top 10 that are currently, I think, most of a threat at this point to Ohio State's postseason aspirations. I was of the opinion that Michigan was going to kind of wither away as its road schedule began to take shape. Granted, they still have to go to USC this weekend, and Ohio State versus Washington notwithstanding, there are a lot of Midwestern and East Coast time zone teams that have struggled to go find success out on these West Coast road trips as the Big Ten has expanded in recent seasons. Look no further than the aforementioned Penn State versus UCLA game last weekend. That being said, Michigan did handle business against Nebraska in a game that I picked them to lose the last time that we spoke. And although I do anticipate that they will lose to USC this weekend, that remains to be seen. And they have since sort of rounded into form and are now suddenly a top 15 team. And with the way that a lot of other of Ohio State's opponents have fallen by the wayside in the rankings of late, it's shaping up to where Michigan, by season's end, could end up being the highest ranked team that Ohio State plays in the regular season. So, assuming that Ohio State were to play Oregon or Indiana in the Big Ten championship, because they're not going to see them in the regular season, looping them in with Michigan among those other three teams near the top four, if you will, in the Big Ten right now, which of those three would you say holds the biggest threat towards beating this current Ohio State team?
Can I answer that question for you at 7 p.m. on Saturday? We're going to see Oregon and Indiana play on Saturday, and I might have a better answer for you then. But I think, in a vacuum, my answer would be Oregon. Like, I think Oregon is, in my opinion, at least like going into this week's game, I think Oregon is the best of those three teams, the most complete of those three teams. Now, I'm very intrigued to see that game. Well, see what I can, since I'll be, covering the game at Illinois and then driving back. So I don't know how much of it I'll actually see, but maybe, catching up on the highlights and stuff on Sunday. I'm intrigued to see how that game plays out, because I do think Indiana, from what I've seen, I think Indiana is better than it was last year, and it made the college football playoff last year. So I think Indiana's legit. I think Indiana's going to be a college football playoff team. Based on what we saw this past weekend, I would now pick Indiana to win that game at Penn State. But I think in terms of, I would predict that Oregon will win on Saturday, and I would predict that I think whoever wins that game on Saturday will very likely make the Big Ten championship game, especially if it is Oregon. And so I would predict, I mean, if I'm sitting here right now, I would predict that Ohio State and Oregon will meet in the Big Ten championship game. And I think that Oregon is the opponent in that game that, uh, in my mind, would pose the biggest threat to Ohio State. Now, if we're just talking about like who's the biggest threat, like to beat Ohio State, like how do you not say Michigan at this point? Just because of what happened the last 4 years, it's like it's hard to look at anybody right now as like a bigger threat to Ohio State than Michigan just because of what's happened in that game. And I think there's still that question over that game of like Ohio State should beat Michigan on paper. Certainly with what we've seen from these teams over the last few weeks, Ohio State looks like the better team. But can Ohio State get over that mental block? The one thing that's kind of there, they won the national championship. They've proven themselves. It's like that one cloud hanging over the team right now. Will they show up and play their best football in Ann Arbor at the end of November? It's one of those questions I just don't think we're going to know the answer to until that game actually plays out. So, like, on paper, I think Oregon is the team that has the best chance in the Big Ten of beating Ohio State. But because of what's happened the last 4 years, I look at it and say, they got to get through Michigan first.
Yeah, I think you can make a compelling case for all three teams, and it's a little trickier to do it at this stage of the season, given that regardless of how it shakes out, Ohio State wouldn't end up seeing any of these teams until the end of the season, whether that's Michigan at the end of the regular season schedule or Oregon or Indiana in the Big Ten championship. But I think rather than looking at it from a matchup perspective, there's all three of those teams would be playing with an edge against Ohio State for various different reasons. Indiana, it's more of a short term thing. Signetti obviously wants to get that one back after having an extremely strong start to last season and then finally getting tripped up by Ohio State. And that kind of, I think, being more of he probably feels an establishing moment for his program in the Big Ten more so than the dismantling of Illinois that happened a handful of weeks ago, even though that largely impressed not only other people within the Big Ten, but I think the college football public at large. Oregon, it's a little bit more of a long term thing. They've had success against Ohio State in recent years, as recently as last regular season, but obviously in the most important matchups between the schools, whether it's the national championship all the way back in the first college football playoff or the Rose Bowl last year when they became the first number one overall seed in the expanded playoff, they have not been able to beat Ohio State in the most important games when it comes down to it. So being able to get, I wouldn't call it a rematch, but another meeting in a championship level game like the Big Ten championship, you can imagine that that would be probably something that Dan Lanning would be looking forward to getting back more so than any other result in recent memory for Oregon. Then obviously Michigan, they're going to be hosting the game. And regardless of how you feel about how this Ohio State team and its defense matches up against the current Michigan team and the struggles that Bryce Underwood has had with accuracy, even though they are still humming along pretty well outside of one night game against Oklahoma, who profiles as having one of the best defenses in the sport this year. You have to imagine that they're going to be going into that game with a lot of confidence, regardless of. I mean, it would be one thing if they lose every game up until the Michigan the game from this point, but realistically, that's not going to happen. I think even if they take a couple lumps, like losing to USC this weekend, they're still going to be going into that Ohio State game with a lot of confidence. So I would argue, and I would much rather see if I'll put it this way. I don't want to jump all the way in as one of those people that says I would rather see them beat Michigan and lose the national championship than the other way around. But I will say this. I would much rather see them beat Michigan and lose the Big Ten championship than win the Big Ten championship and lose to Michigan. I think beating Michigan this year is so much more important than a consolation conference championship when, and I, calling it a consolation isn't great for the prestige of the Big Ten, but the Big Ten hardly needs it. And we all know what the real prize is, especially after Ohio State lost to Michigan last year and still went on to win the national championship. So I think you can make compelling cases for all three. I think I would agree that Michigan, just because of kind of the hex that has been there in recent seasons, is probably the one that I'm worried about the most relative to those three teams.
Yeah, and I don't think you'd find anyone that would argue with you about beating Michigan being more important than
Oh,
winning.
there's a lot of people trying to put down poo-poo the rivalry now that it's not so important after
Yeah, but
last
among
season.
Ohio State fans, like, I mean, obviously the answer is like you want to win both, but like I think in terms of like what matters more this year, beating Michigan, or I mean winning a Big Ten championship, I think without a doubt it's beating Michigan.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad that you see it my way. Looking at the other side of these rankings. Now, I didn't want to spoil it because I think this was going to be I mean, you're a very obviously one of, if not the most respected journalists in the Ohio State football universe. I call you the Oracle affectionately. You are very professional. The height of confirming the news, verifying everything. You try to be a very credible stand-up guy. I wasn't going to tease the surprise that was going to be there for everybody at the bottom of your rankings, but you did tease it on 11 Warriors Live, so I feel comfortable repeating it here. The last time that we spoke about these Big Ten rankings, we were talking about where does UCLA go from here, because we had them at the very bottom. They had just fired Deshaun Foster. They had just lost to New Mexico at home 35-10. The Nico Iamaleava NIL deal was looking like a disaster. Everything was going off the rails. And then they pull off one of the biggest wins in college football in the last 40 years, frankly, in terms of the upset over Penn State. And realistically, how can you rank Penn State ahead of UCLA when UCLA just beat them head to head? So I I commend you. I think this only heightens your credibility that you would drop Penn State and James Franklin and Jim Knowles and Drew Aller to the depths, the very bottom, the pit of the Big Ten after such an embarrassing loss. And so I have to ask you, are they just going to, like, has their season basically been detonated at this point? Or do you think that they look at it from the perspective of, if we really are at the bottom, as we are in Dan Hope's estimation, can we only go up from here, and can we maybe salvage our season, and potentially, with only 2 losses and one of them being to Oregon that profiles as one of the top teams in college football, can we potentially battle ourselves back into the CFP conversation?
Yeah, maybe I'll give them the bulletin board material they need to turn their season around. So apologies if that happens, but yeah, you just look at, their season as a whole. I mean, it's not like, I know it may look like an overreaction to one loss to say like, okay, they were fourth and now they're 18th, but okay, like you said, UCLA was the clear-cut worst team in the conference entering week 6, period. Like, there was no debate that UCLA was the worst team in the conference entering week 6. Yeah, the Oregon loss is more understandable, double overtime against one of the best teams in the country. But what has Penn State done? They've beaten nobody. You look at who they've played. They've played Nevada, Florida International, and Villanova. They've beaten nobody. So
And
what?
struggled in the early stages of a
Right.
lot of those games too.
Right. So they're at the bottom because they haven't done anything yet. They haven't proved anything yet. And the best evidence we have right now of this team is they lost to a terrible UCLA. Like, that is, if without a doubt you take the totality of their season right now, their season is without a doubt defined by, you just lost to UCLA. So do I expect Penn State to remain at the bottom of the rankings all year long? No. I expect them to move up. I expect them to win more games. But I think right now, like, they are having the worst season of any Big Ten team. Like, especially relative to the expectations that they came in with. Now, to your question about, is their season over? It's not over, but it's certainly getting close, because I think for them to make the college football playoff, they have to win out. And that means they have to beat Ohio State and Columbus, which is not going to be an easy task. And so I think they do still have a path to the CFP because of that, because they still play Ohio State and Columbus, because they still play Indiana. That gives them the chance to get 2 quality wins here. And if they can do that and win the rest of their games, they will make the college football playoff. But I think anything short of that, they're out, because you've now got a terrible loss on your resume, which if you end up at 9-3 and you're on the bubble, that UCLA loss will be held against you, and you get absolutely nothing from non-conference play to hang your hat on. So I think because of that, they are very much now they have no margin for error. They have to win out. And based on what we saw last weekend, it's hard to have a lot of confidence that that is something that they are going to do.
Yeah, and earlier in the show, I alluded to the fact that Michigan might end up being the highest ranked team Ohio State plays at this point, given the fall that Penn State and Texas have had. But so, which kind of takes a lot of shine off of what going into the preseason or coming out of the preseason rather. I mean, this was looking like the Penn State Ohio State game was going to be a much more anticipated contest than Ohio State Michigan, even as Ohio State is looking to finally get the monkey off its back it's had in recent seasons post COVID against its biggest rival, as opposed to its not a rival in Penn State.
If only
Penn
someone could have told Fox that Penn State would lose to UCLA, then maybe Ohio State fans would have got a night game against Penn State.
Well, the way that you have just framed it, in terms of Ohio State could potentially serve as the nail in the coffin on Penn State's postseason aspirations, I think suddenly makes this game highly intriguing again. Because given the bad
Penn
blood,
State still has to survive Kinnick. They go to Kinnick next week. I think they will beat Northwestern. I don't know if they'll beat Northwestern because I thought there was zero chance they'd lose to
Northwestern
UCLA.
beat UCLA and
Right,
Penn State couldn't
right.
do that.
So I think they'll beat Northwestern. I'm not like supremely confident that, but that, Kinnick, that's a tough place to play in a night game on the road. So yeah, they based on what happened last week, the last thing they can afford to do is be looking ahead to that Ohio State game. But to your point, if they are able to win out until then, that is going to be a massive stakes game for the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, but I would argue that Ohio State fans are probably looking much more forward to that under those circumstances that Penn State would be. I think given how much weight is against James Franklin now in terms of overcoming elite opponents in big games, it's really a your back is against the wall moment for James Franklin under those circumstances. And if you're an Ohio State fan, you're going to be licking your chops, and especially because it's Jim Knowles returning to Columbus. I mean, Ryan Day never got to hang 100 on Jim Harbaugh, but if he's going to hang 100 on anybody, I hope it would be Penn State's defense come November 1st. So we have that to look forward to, but one game at a time. One ranked Big Ten team I did overlook in that discussion of the ones near the top of the Big Ten is the Illinois Fighting Illini, who Ohio State still has to beat this weekend in their own house. So Illinois is going to come correct. I know that they lost a lot of their luster after getting spanked by Indiana, granted, but they got a nice bounce back win against USC. They perhaps didn't beat Purdue as soundly as some people may have estimated they should have this past weekend, but still hung over 40 points on the Boilermakers in their own home. I think it'll be a competitive game. That being said, I would still think Ohio State takes care of business, but one game at a time, one Dubcast at a time. We're going to wait to preview the Illinois game until the last show this week on Friday. Until then, we will be back tomorrow with Andy Anders to examine some more topics that are hot this week around Ohio State football. But until then, Dan, thank you very much for joining me tonight. You can read Dan's full estimation of the Big Ten in his power rankings releasing today on 11warriors.com. Until then, Dan, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast, and thank you to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, for sponsoring the Dubcast and 11 Warriors this Ohio State football season. We'll be back tomorrow morning with Andy Anders. Tune in then. Take care, folks.